Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the Unlearning Economics stream. I am speaking to Dr. Stuart Mills today about mostly AI, digital economy stuff, but maybe we'll link it to some broader stuff about behaviour and political economy. Stuart, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, you're a respected academic who's produced a lot of research on this topic, I think. But you're more importantly, you are also an occasional chatter of mine, aren't you? You are sometimes lurking in chat. Um,
Yes.
yeah. So I was thinking like it would be really nice to actually speak to you. And here we are. So most of your recent work. Let's dive right in. The
Yeah.
topic that I think a lot of people are going to want to hear about is all the rage at the moment is of course AI, artificial intelligence, and that's what most of your recent research has been on, right? And I just want to start with, I guess, a fairly basic question, although it may not actually be that basic. When we talk about AI these days, what are we actually talking about?
Um, no, that is a good question. But it depends how far back you want to get into it. But
How far
I
back are we going to go?
like, I mean, on the one hand, I can say the funny thing of all AI used to be cybernetics, but Norbert Wiener fell out with I want to say Warren McCulloch, but it might have been someone else. Either way, they had a conference, they had a falling out, and the term artificial intelligence was coined simply because a bunch of academics didn't like Norbert Wiener and didn't want to use the term cybernetics.
What's so
So,
bad? What's so bad about Norbert Wiener? What's he done?
well, I think he's quite a famous MIT mathematician, and I think he was just big American professor, kind of full of himself, sort of thing. You know, big personalities clash.
Yeah, sounds about
Um,
right.
but it's quite dramatic that until about the 70s or the 80s, you get one version of AI, which is a lot about logic-based systems and kind of trying to understand the rules of thinking through problems and problem solving. And then since the 80s, you get more of this neural network kind of stuff, which has important differences in terms of what knowledge means and so on and so forth. But fundamentally, the AI we talk about today are essentially prediction systems. They're
Mhm.
trying to spot patterns in data and come up with predictions from those patterns. Um, and whether it is intelligence or not, I think is a philosophical question. But a good enough prediction can often convince people that there is some intelligence or some forethought happening. I'm not sure there is within these machines, but really we're talking about prediction engines here.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of putting it, I think. And I mean, I was puzzled. I was thinking, are we going to get into the philosophical question of like whether it's intelligence? I detected from your tone there that you weren't really sure if you had a definitive answer on that. But I mean, I guess one way to slightly dodge the philosophical question is to just like think about this as a statistical thing, right? And
Yeah.
one question I would ask, which I always think is, people make this comparison sometimes. Would you say AI, as we know it, ChatGPT being the canonical example, is it can it be distinguished clearly from just like a Google search? Would you say?
Um, uh, I guess it depends what you mean by distinguished. I I've been writing recently, and I would argue that one of the better ways to think about something like ChatGPT is as a new means of navigating information. And you can put it in the same category of a recommendation algorithm or a search bar. You go onto a website, and there's a bunch of information and you need to navigate it. We used to have the search bar where you used to know what to put in. Then we had the recommendation algorithm where some data was used to try and predict what you wanted. And now we have the chatbot where there's natural language interfacing. Um, and from that perspective, I'm not sure it's that different to a Google search. And I'd be tempted to say it's good if you prefer the natural language interaction. Some of the studies we've been seeing about AI chatbot deployment around this information management perspective seems to suggest that people don't like using them, which there's two ways to go with that. One is people don't trust it or they're not like culturally used to it yet, and in a few years we'll all be using chatbots. The other way is, well, maybe natural language interaction, if you're trying to search something, isn't actually that efficient way of finding information. So maybe it's just simply not a very good information filter. Um, but that is how I would think about it. If you want to put it in the same ballpark as a Google search, then think about it as an information management tool and ask yourself, do you prefer the natural language interaction, or do you prefer where you need to kind of have a reasonable idea of the core words you're looking for?
So you mean people are just like put off? People are like put off by the idea that they're having a conversation, as opposed to like just clicking links and things like that, as Google presents you with.
Well, in the studies where people are given access to a chatbot,
Hmm.
over 50% of the time people just don't use the chatbot. It's just not an intuitive way of navigating websites for them. The people that do use the chatbot do seem to enjoy it, which is maybe some evidence of like a, I guess, selection bias, right? If you're more predisposed to even click on the bot, perhaps you're more predisposed to enjoy the interaction.
Right.
Um, but if we're thinking about it, is it the same as a Google search, or does it replace Google, or thinking about it in that universe? I tentatively say it's just an alternative way of navigating
Mm.
information which
Mm.
already exists, which will appeal to some people and won't appeal to others.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose what I meant was, and I'm not sure. Maybe this is what you're saying, and I'm just missing it. But what I meant was, is it just it's predictive in the same way as a Google search, right? Does it use many of the same kinds of logics and
Uh,
algorithms, right? Yeah. Do you see what I'm
yeah,
getting at?
well, on that basis, then I'd say it's completely different.
Oh, right. Okay. Okay.
If we're talking about the underlying algorithmic
Yeah.
infrastructure, um, Google changes things all the time. We don't ever quite know what the Google algorithm is, but based on PageRank as it originally was, it's just about how many websites link to one another as a measure of interest. Whereas if you're using ChatGPT, it doesn't really matter how much prompt engineering is going on behind the scenes. It's still essentially a trying to predict the next word in a sequence and looking at what has come before and thinking what kind of makes sense based on training on huge amounts of data. It's fundamentally a very different algorithm. Um, there are some people I know who would suggest that the prompt engineering plays a greater role in how that predictive algorithm works, but they're not doing the same things. They're not treating data the same way. It's why, to a large extent, I think how we experience AI is, or what AI is largely a product of how we experience it, rather than rather than thinking about it as being super intelligent. But algorithmically, very, very different.
Hmm. No. Okay. Okay. Yeah, that's a really good answer to my question. I mean, I don't know if you've. I read this article. It was just a Medium article. It was quite well circulated, but it was saying how one of the ways that these AIs can break quite in a predictable way, and I don't mean you've talked about hallucinations, right? We've heard about those where it just sort of
Yeah.
cites an article that doesn't exist for no reason. But there's this really, and it goes back to what you were saying, there's this really strong psychological effect where people talk to it like it's a person, right? And if you stop talking to it like it's a person, it kind of gets a bit confused, and it can't. You have to do a sort of improv yes and with it, right? So it needs the human input, and if you stop doing that, then it just sort of breaks.
Well, I imagine to an extent that's because, like, if you try and use something like GPT-4 and build a chatbot yourself
Mm.
using the interface, the common guidance is always prompt it that it is a user interface, that it is a helpful assistant. Right? All the prompt engineering around most of these applications basically say to the AI, anticipate an interaction with a person where you will be having a back and forth conversation. So part of it, I think, is built into
Mm,
the, for lack of a better word, anticipations of the AI.
mm,
Part of it is, I think, as human beings, we're a naturally very social species, it's perhaps counterintuitive to interact with something which kind of feels like it might be intelligent in a way that is totally degrading to that intelligence. Most people, I think, naturally will talk to it as if it is a person.
mm,
um, because it does a very good job of producing language which kind of looks and feels like a person said it.
mm. Yeah, but then like you said that quite a lot of people are put off. So I wonder if it's like if there's like a type of person who maybe isn't put off. I mean, I did see somewhere, I'm not sure if it was in one of your papers, but men use AI a lot more than women. Like, and I wonder if it like it that there's something to that, and like women are just one of the groups of people who are much less happy interacting with it because although it seems like a person, it obviously isn't, right?
I, I don't know. I don't know that paper. From my reading, I do think we need more research into the human AI interactions just around when AI actually gets used. But there is research around like the sort of the context of the conversation matters. So people will trust AI a lot more if it's telling you about recycling than they will if it's telling you how to raise your kids and things like
Right.
that. Right?
Okay.
The context certainly matters. Um, and again, I think we probably need more research into this. Whether people think they're talking to a human or to an AI, I suspect is relevant, not because the output would be different, but because I think when we interact with if say if you interact with a chatbot in a sales setting, so
Mm.
you go to Amazon and a chatbot pops up and it's like, how can I help you today? Um, you're probably going to think to yourself, okay, what is this chatbot trying to get me to buy? Right? What is it trying to get me to do? But
Mm.
there'll be a certain amount of skepticism there. Um, but if you put it in a different setting, if you put it in, let's be optimistic. If you put it in a healthcare setting where you're trying to find some information about some rash you've got, and a chatbot pops up saying, "How can I help?" You might be more willing to use it because in that setting, it's trying to help me find the accurate medical information. So how we think about those interactions and the context in which those interactions happen
Mm.
I think is substantially important.
Do you have any sense of like what type of things they are actually more reliable for, like chatbots? Is there like any sort of record of like categories? Because you mentioned like raising your children versus like recycling versus medical advice, right? Are there any studies into like where it actually gives good advice versus where it actually gives bad advice, like apart from people's perceptions of that advice?
Yeah, AI tends to be very good at what word do I want to use? I want to say AI tends to be very good at things that require simple answers, but that's probably the wrong framing. It's good at things where I think that there's a reasonably obvious metric of whether
Mm.
something is correct or not.
Yeah.
So a reason a lot of AI intelligence ranking is essentially uses uh, various high school and college exams is because they have mark schemes where you can very easily give it a score out of 100 or whatever.
Yeah.
The same thing with like getting it to code things. You can kind of grade whether code works or not reasonably easily.
Yes.
And it's natural that those things where there's an easy feedback metric would be the thing AI is best at because it factors into the whole giving the model feedback as it learns over time. It can optimize towards things where there's a
Mm.
clear yes no measure. Um, it's much, much worse, for lack of a better word, when you want it for something qualitative. So AI some research suggests that AI is okay at predicting sort of opinion polls about different policies. But if you were to ask it to elaborate on why it thinks a person would believe this, or say, pretend to be this person, tell me what they think, tell me what their
Yeah.
life's like, and then you look at that qualitative data, it's nothing like reality at all. But again, that stuff is kind of hard to objectively measure. Yes, no, is this correct? So I'm not necessarily surprised that the AI hasn't been optimized to those outputs, but it might be optimized to things like predicting polls from populations and things like that.
It's really interesting because that, to me, that does seem to be like the distinguishing factor that makes me think it's not human, right? Or not intelligence, I should say, not right? Like if it can't even begin to understand why somebody would do something, right? That's like it seems like quite a because I've had so many like I've thought about this a lot, and I've had like debates with friends and people like who think that AI is kind of intelligence, right? And it's like that seems like a quite a clear line if it can't reproduce that kind of like what are people thinking, which is a fairly basic human function, I'd say.
I mean, I think one of the great shames of the AI boom right now is it kind of distracts from the genuinely brilliant engineering
Mm.
and ingenuity that has gone into building these systems. If we called ChatGPT like a diffusion engine or a diffusion machine, and we emphasized how predictive AI has been flipped on its head, and we've done, well, I say we as in the human race, we've done various tinkering things to change how that predictive AI works to then be able to produce outputs which feel kind of genuine, feel kind of real. That's an amazing feat of engineering. That's
Yeah,
something that we should really emphasize. But if you look at it from that technical perspective, it's obviously not intelligence.
yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
it just the only reason we're calling it artificial intelligence, in my opinion, right now, is part of this financial hype cycle because these models are expensive to run,
Mm.
and because to get the training data, you probably need to violate all sorts of social contracts, if not social liberties.
Yeah,
And so calling it AI and saying this is going to change the world gives you that sort of political power to force through the economics that you need to make these machines work. But if we were actually talking about the engineering, we'd
mm.
call it something completely different, and there'd still be reasons to be amazed by it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think it's interesting. It's probably a misnomer, and I think it does distract from the real advances that have been made and the real potential applications and some of the issues that come up with AI or whatever we want to call it, right? So I mean, let's talk to these because this is really what your research is about, as far as I'm aware, right? Your I think there's this notion that I think people have of technology where it just sort of appears, and people are like, AI, what's going to happen with AI? Now we've got AI, what are the impacts of AI? And you can even relate that to like neoclassical models, economic models of like technological change, where it's like exogenous and it doesn't really have a political aspect, to say the least, right? So I think everything I've read from you about AI seems to be directly opposed to that, right? You're saying, no, it came from somewhere, whatever we call it. We could call it what we like, diffusion machine or diffusion engine. I quite like that name. It came from somewhere. It's being used for a bunch of purposes. And even more than that, right, it's going to provoke various reactions, political reactions that are going to change it. So let's talk about a little bit about this. I mean, you were hinting at it earlier, right? But why do you think it has taken off now? What purpose is it serving for certain groups or businesses or people?
Um, I mean, I'll start myself from giving a long history. The direct answer to your question, I think, is um, Western economies are overwhelmingly knowledge based nowadays. Um, Perhaps since the financial crisis, though some might even go back even earlier, the economic growth model of much of the West has begun to collapse. We are entering a period of economic stagnation. Globalization is taking its forces, and we are only now in the past few years kind of rediscovering that it's important where stuff is made and who makes it, right?
Mm.
Um, so if you have a model where you don't really care about where stuff is made, everything is based on information, and the economy is run by knowledge workers, but all of a sudden you've got this productivity crisis, then the technology is naturally going to orientate itself towards optimistically augmenting knowledge and information work, but more realistically, automating knowledge work and information work. Um, the grand promise of AI companies today, if you really, really boil it down, is give us enough money to build the largest machine in human history. We will give it all of the data that humans have ever come up with, and we will create a super intelligence, which means you never have to hire workers again. Right? That is the grand promise of it. And it's because if you are uh, a Western business and you're looking at your development model and you don't want to have to bring factories back because workers are expensive, but you aren't able to make the profits you want anymore and productivity is sluggish, you're naturally going to think, okay, how can we trim the fat? Which in Western economies will be how can we trim the knowledge workers? Um, all of this talk around prompt engineering is just about de-skilling people. It's just about getting people to not think about the fact that they contribute ideas to how businesses work. And many of the AI applications we see, which I generally think are not value enhancing, they're all about transferring human initiative over to an AI and turning knowledge workers into much simpler, essentially data handlers where they type into a computer. And sooner or later, those jobs will go too. So I'm not saying this will happen, but I think that's the political economic impetus.
Mm.
That the economy has changed, it's now shaped around knowledge work, it's facing productive crises. And so the technology which emerges tries to respond to those productive crises in terms of targeting and changing knowledge work.
Yeah, that's such an interesting answer. I mean, it's like this. It almost feels like this dream of like capitalism, like without workers, right? And like just like them just being able to completely, fully automate, automate the whole process and automate profits. And I suppose it goes to this issue of ownership as well, because it's like who owns the AI matters. That's like probably the most important thing, and that's probably the simplest way you could link that technology to politics, right? You just say, well,
Yeah,
whose hands is it in?
yeah, yeah. I mean, I was related to the ownership. I was doing some research and some writing last week on uh, something called digital cloning. It's kind of an emerging idea where you train an AI on loads of data about yourself, including how you make decisions and your personality and things like that, in the hope of building an artificial version of yourself, a clone that can kind of predict what you would decide in different situations. And that's a cool idea and it has potentially cool applications. So if you were a government and you wanted to model how a policy would work, there are potential advantages to testing it on the digital clones of your country before you're actually rolling it out. But it raises these really important questions of who owns the clone, who has the authority to make a clone of yourself, of you, and so on and so forth. But that's just a small nugget of this wider question of ownership. Um, and I wrote on my blog once. I'm not a techno pessimist. I'm mostly a techno apathist. Um, I like technology unlocks capabilities for us. It gives us alternative things that we can do, but those capabilities always come at a trade-off. And whether it's AI or whether it's any other technology, I think it's really, really interesting how little we are talking about the trade-off in terms of capabilities. Um, and
Mate,
let's be
dude, I'm so sorry. This is really interesting. I like actually. Please carry on. My doorbell is going mental. I don't know who's at it. I'm really sorry. Please carry on. Please carry on, though.
okay.
So
Okay,
sorry.
I will take over. I will entertain. Um, yeah. So we talk about technology unlocks capabilities. It gives us abilities to do different things, but those capabilities always come at a trade-off. Um, the technology conversation we're having right now, and which we have been having for maybe the past 30 to 50 years is rarely about this trade-off in terms of capabilities, and it's always focusing on technology being an inevitability, as the implementation of technology necessarily correlating with progress. Um, and so questions around things like let's take AI on its face value. Let's say it's actually going to change the world. It's actually brilliant. Why aren't we having more conversations about, okay, then why don't I get to work less, right?
Mm.
Why aren't we having more conversations about, okay, well, how do we make sure everyone has enough food? We ignore the fact that technology is what we make of it, and we ignore these trade-offs in terms of capabilities. Um, and focus much more on the sort of inevitable march of progress, which is a political narrative. It's not a reality. Insert that Graeber line about the
Yeah.
future being whatever we want to make it.
Yeah, 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 exactly. No, yeah, so yes, yes. Sorry again about that, everybody. I don't know how many times that person rang my doorbell, and then when I got there, they were gone. So I have no idea who they are. It was like I thought someone was dying or something. Like how many times it was rung. I was like something bad is happening. But no, no phone calls, so everyone is fine. I think. Right. So could you? I might have missed this, but I just there was a lot in what you said there, right? I just want you to tell us a little bit about this clone. Did you? Because I don't think you told us any actual specifics, right? Well, like what did you try? What can you do with it? What did you try to get it to do? Because it's
Um,
quite funny,
the
that idea.
so the digital cloning's been around for a couple of years, as far as
Yeah.
I can tell. It initially popped up when the metaverse was a big thing. When people were talking about you could make a digital clone of yourself, and they called it physical clones. Um, since the metaverse has kind of died and AI has become popular, the phrase has evolved to talk more about cognitive clones. So training an AI on data about how you make decisions, about your personality, about your risk preferences, and also about all sorts of stuff about who you are, your hobbies and interests, so on and so forth. Loads and loads of deep personal data about you. You create this artificial agent which knows all of this stuff, and then you say to the agent, uh, essentially, pretend to be this person. Um, and once it's pretending to be you, you can ask it, in this situation, what would you do? And you then compare what the clone would do to what you actually do. Um, right now, there's only one study I know of that's explicitly done this. They uh, cloned about 1,000 people, and they showed that the clones have about, off the top of my head, about 85% accuracy in predicting social attitudes. Um,
Wow.
so more research needs to be done. Obviously, it's one study and it's one survey, but it's interesting that if and in my writing I say this, if we take it seriously, if we accept that it is a powerful predictive tool, then we need to ask fundamental questions about control and ownership. If it isn't a powerful predictive tool, then we kind of don't need to worry about it. But I suspect the narrative is going to be much more it's a powerful predictive tool than it is just kind of bullshit dressed up. Yeah.
I mean, 85%. That's pretty astonishing. I actually didn't. I feel like I've underestimated AI. I have to say. I never used to care about it until it became like a bigger thing, and I continually, for a while. I mean, I don't really use ChatGPT, but I don't even think ChatGPT is the one to use anymore. I've used it for a bit of coding, and it wasn't even that good
No.
at that. I remember. But like these things are pretty remarkable. 85% prediction of social attitudes. Like that's pretty like I don't know. Do I? Because there's testing it against the actual you, right? But
Yeah.
then there's also internal validity over time. So do I have 85% predictive power over
So
myself in the future? It
yeah,
might be
so
better
what
at
what
predicting me than me.
yeah, so what was interesting about this study is the raw accuracy was only 69%. But when you adjust for the fact that people are inconsistent about what they
Oh,
think over
okay.
time, it
Yeah.
rises to 85. So
Yeah.
that's the normalized
Okay.
figure.
That's the normalized
Um,
figure. Yeah.
yeah, and I should say it's important to distinguish between digital cloning and simulation. Digital clones are recreations of real people. simulation or recreations of representative populations, of which the agent within that representative population might not map onto any real person at all. Um,
Mm.
and those sort of population estimates at the high level, they can have high accuracy. Once you dig down into the detail, poor representation of like minority groups and things like that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Of course. That's one of these things that seems to come up again and again with all of this tech, right? I mean, everything from I remember face recognition software like search engines and these LLMs and now AI, right? It's like always seems to be treating basically white Western men as the default, and it
Yeah,
does
yeah,
poorly on various metrics for minority groups and even women and non-Western people.
yeah. And I would say other people might disagree, but even 85% accuracy, I don't think is high enough to justify it being deployed in
Mm.
important social settings.
Yeah.
My sort of is perhaps an extreme test, but my test is always: would you plug in the nuclear weapon system to this computer? And if your answer is no, it's not high enough. Right?
That's that's such an interesting question. Would I ever plug in a nuclear weapon system to a computer? I suppose that there's this issue of trust, isn't there? That I think is it gets to what we're saying, and you can't trust. Can you ever trust one of these models? Like it's almost an absurd question.
Well, I, I know we might get onto dark patterns, so this
Yeah,
may
yeah,
be a
yeah,
tangent.
yeah.
This may be a tangent if you want it. One of my sort of big emphases about the internet and how people use the internet and how people make decisions on the internet is humans are flexible. We can respond to different situations. Machines inevitably reach a point where they are inflexible. There will always be a hard limit in their code. And lots of the reasons why the internet sucks nowadays is the human touch has been taken out and it's
Mm.
been replaced with an automated system, which is just naturally not flexible. Um, and when it comes to AI, when it comes to trust, it's the same problem of 99% of the time, the AI might do a great job, but it's often that 1% of the time where you need the flexibility that has the outsized impact on whether something becomes a crisis or whether a system fails or something like
Mm.
that. The flexibility is so crucial in so many important systems which keep our society running. Um, and machines at this point, generative AI kind of shows flexibility, but machines at this point still don't have the flexibility and the real time adaptiveness of human beings.
Yeah, there's that Simpsons clip. I don't know if you remember it, but it's like where the I think the students' test scores are going through this machine. Their tests are going through this machine that's just marking them automatically, and it sort of breaks down, and then there's it pans to like a guy, just an old man in like a rocking chair who just like hits it with a broom and then it gets going again, right? Like it's like that 1% of the time where you just need someone to hit it with a broom. The machines, I don't think, like you said, it seems like they can't do that. They don't have that flexibility,
Yeah.
robustness, whatever you want to call it.
And what's kind of interesting, I apologize, this is a tangent. What's kind of interesting is in the instances where you can kind of compare an algorithmic outcome to what people kind of want, there are many times where the justifications for using the algorithm are not really considered valid by the population at large. So you and I will know during COVID, an algorithm was used to give high school kids their grades, right? Um, and lots of controversy around this algorithm because it embedded things like whether you went to a private school or not.
Yeah.
And that was kind of like the headline argument or headline sort of controversy. But if you dig into the detail of why the algorithm was developed, it was because the Department of Education thought that teachers would have been biased towards their students and given them higher grades. And the data 100% supported that. Teachers were biased, students got higher grades. But most people, like most citizens, kind of cared more that people got an advantage because they went to private school
Mm.
than kids were given higher grades because their teachers were trying to help them out. But that there are arguments for why we should use machines, which people don't actually think are very good arguments when you ask them.
Mm. Yeah, and I guess it's just like to trust a teacher to make some kind of judgment, right, is to have trust in the idea of teaching as a profession and in the individual and in those social relations. Whereas what the AI is doing is taking, or the algorithm is taking, quite is taking certain indicators, right, and quite comparatively coarse data compared to what a human takes in, which I guess is kind of rich and everything, right? The algorithm's just saying, well, private school, therefore higher grade, and apart from the inequality, that seems quite crude.
Yeah,
Now, I don't know if our intuitions are correct about this because I have seen that actually um, there are cases where teachers can obviously be really biased. I mean, we were talking about racial bias, right, and
yeah, yeah.
sexist bias, right? So that it's not like we're letting people off the hook, but it is. I mean, I don't know to what extent we're right and what extent we're wrong about that. Whether we should trust machines more, or whether we're onto something fundamental.
No, but this is why I would argue, well, this is why I say I'm a techno-apathist, right? The conversation isn't really, or shouldn't really be, can the technology do it? Because
Yeah,
it can. I don't really care. It should be, what should it do? How should it be
yeah,
done? And what are we compromising if we use this technology?
mm,
I don't feel like we regularly have those conversations.
yeah. Yeah, how? What is an example? And it doesn't have to be teaching where you can see a really good use for AI and you think it would really work in that context.
Um, the example that comes to mind is that there's been some research that used machine learning and then by proxy kind of implied that machine learning could be used to look at doctors' decisions to test patients. And I think that's a reasonably good example. The results were that people who were actually at a high risk typically were under tested, and people who were at a low risk were over tested. That,
Yeah,
as an economist, that seems to me like a clear example of where resources are being inefficiently allocated. And if we used an algorithm, we would probably get more efficiency, but we would also probably get more people living longer. I don't know enough about medical
yeah,
decision making to know if that's actually an accurate assessment. That's just what the research says. Um, so I should say that there's lots and lots of writing about how AI will replace doctors, and it's been going on for 70 years, this debate, and it never seems to actually replace doctors. So I'm probably talking nonsense here, but that to me would be kind of an example where, as long as you're not removing the doctor's discretion, as long as there's
mm,
robust evidence that it's allocating medical resources more efficiently, it's saving patients time and money and pain, and it's actually delivering better outcomes for patients, then I would see a reasonably positive use for it there.
I mean, it seems like a case of using it as a kind of consultant or something, as like a
Mm.
check or something like that, right? Because it can check human biases, but then, like you said, if the doctor can override it,
Yeah.
then can veto it, right? Then I think you hopefully get the best of both worlds.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I should say that's my major concern. I want to say I tweeted it, but I didn't tweet it. I used it on the blue site. I posted it on the blue site.
You skeeted
Um,
it.
is that what we say
We say
nowadays?
skeeting. Yeah, there are a few stages. At first, you'll reject the term skeeting, and then you will accept it, and then you will badger others to use it.
It just makes me think of like all those TikTok words I don't understand. Uh, so I skeeted. The reason I bring up the sort of history of AI in medical decision making, and this is a really, really contemporary thing that I think we should highlight. For the longest time, the concern about using algorithms and AI in decision making was that the programmers of those algorithms would be biased and that they would lack the expert knowledge that doctors have, and therefore the tools would lead to catastrophic errors. That sort of concern hasn't gone away, but the rhetoric has changed nowadays, and this is behavioral scientists' fault, in my opinion,
Yeah.
where we are now talking about why AI and algorithms should be used in medical decision making because doctors are biased, right? The idea of being biased is now being used to undermine the profession and push the technology. Whereas historically, it was always bias undermined the technology and elevated the professional status.
Yeah, because it's like who do you trust? Who do you trust more? You trust the to do medicine. You trust the doctors more than like the data scientists, right? And I think there's also this accountability problem where it's like who is truly responsible for the outputs of an AI, right? Because like
It's
multiple people will have worked in it. You don't necessarily know who they are. You people don't know how it works. They can be a black box, right? Um, so that would seem to me to be what the original problem that you identified is more of a problem, and it's something that
Yeah,
people should be focusing
I,
on.
I, yeah, and I could very much see a scenario where 99 times out of 100, the AI makes the right decision. And over time, the doctor will find themselves kind of enslaved by that algorithm because it's so accurate so much of the
Yeah,
time. If they ever wanted to overrule it, they would need a huge argument for it.
yeah,
And most of the time, that argument just wouldn't stand. And then the one time the algorithm's wrong,
yeah,
who takes the blame? It would be the doctor because, well, why did the doctor not spot this thing that led to catastrophic failure? And the doctor would have nominally the discretion to overrule the algorithm, but if it's too accurate, that discretion, as I say, becomes nominal, and most of the time, it will eventually just be an automated process
mm,
in all but name.
yeah. I mean, to what extent is it actually being used in medicine at the moment? Do you know or how?
I think it's increasingly used in things like cancer screening,
Okay,
but I don't think right now it is that widespread. Like I say, I'm not a health economist. I don't have a health background, so I might be wrong in that.
okay, okay. So one of the things you've written about is bullshit jobs, and you mentioned Graeber, and my chat will be happy that I've mentioned bullshit jobs because everybody loves it as an idea. But this how this links to like AI and like management and stuff. I found it really interesting. So could you speak a little bit to that? And I know you did touch on it earlier, but
Yeah, yeah. Firstly, the paper will hopefully be out in like a couple of days' time, so you can all go and read it. Um,
I'll
my
post it.
my
I'll post it.
myself and my boss slash colleague slash co-author David Spencer, um, we've spent quite a lot of time essentially asking ourselves, is AI actually being applied to do anything useful? Because we kept waiting. We were talking just casually about, oh, have you heard about this new thing or this that? And each time sort of new use case or new announcement came out about an AI product, we're kind of like, but is this useful? And so we came up with well, we came up with an idea we call efficient inefficiency, which might be a bad name, but that's the name we've gone with. And our argument is essentially if you look around at the modern workplace, a huge amount of what is done is debatably worthless, or if you accept that it adds value, AI is being applied in such ways that probably destroys that value. Um, so if I give you an example, one of the big AI applications people are talking about are performance reviews in organizations. Um, and let's say, for the sake of argument, that performance reviews contribute positively to productivity. Some of you might disagree. But let's say it did. Break down that task. Where is the actual value of performance review coming from? It comes through the personal interaction between a manager and the person that they manage, right? The ability to talk about what's going well and what isn't, for the worker to voice their concerns, and for both people to get on the same page of this is how we are going to uh, develop the role and push forward in the next 12 months or so, right? It's meant to be about this interpersonal interaction, which leads to better team working. All of the AI applications around automating performance reviews are essentially The worker types in what they think's doing well, and AI reads it and then creates a report which the manager can then rubber stamp as saying this is okay. It completely automates the actual value added,
Mm.
and it only proliferates the creation of reports that nobody actually reads or cares about.
Yeah.
And there's loads of examples of this. I will shut up in a second, but I really encourage, if you've not seen it, Google or look up Apple's recent ad about AI intelligence or Apple intelligence. It's a man goes into a boardroom, he sits down, he gets asked to summarize a report which everyone in the boardroom was meant to have read. And then he's not done his job, he scuttles out the room and he uses AI to summarize it. And he goes back and he says, okay, here are the points. And I hate that advert
Yeah.
because if everyone has read it, what they don't need is a generic summary. What they're asking for is, what do you, as
Mm.
person we have hired because you have specific skills and knowledge, what do you think? What are you going to contribute? But Apple is advertising its AI as a way of automating the that function without actually contributing any value.
Mm. Yeah, that's quite a striking example. That's quite a striking example of just like pure bullshit, right? Basically, because it's completely useless. But it's people use that term deliverable, don't they? I mean, I don't work in the
Yeah.
private sector, so I've never heard it said to me. But it's a deliverable, but it's like that. It's defined by like what you're by the job, like by doing a job, by like doing the thing that you're doing. It's very like
Yeah.
empty and tautological, right? And it's like that. It's just like it's just utterly worthless.
There's a famous misattribution that you, the quote "you measure what matters" or whatever it's
Right,
famously misattributed to Drucker.
right.
Drucker did talk about that idea, but he spoke about it in the context of beware what you measure because what you measure ends up start being becomes what people think
Yeah,
matters. And
yeah,
AI falls fully into that trap of it automates to the point that we can massively increase what we measure.
yeah.
But the stuff we measure is often completely irrelevant to the question of where does productivity come from?
Mm. I mean, I'm reminded of Laura Gerge, who works at LSE in PBS. Who
Yeah,
she her one of her main things is about she studies work, right? And one of her main things is about emails. She always talks about emails and how many of them we send, right? And that was already bad. It didn't need AI to be bad, right? We already had that kind of bullshit. Too many emails, taking up too much of people's times, useless emails and everything. But now there's this thing of like automating.
yeah,
So
yeah.
AI is doing it.
You, you're going. Apple is also advertising auto reply, so you don't even have
Yeah.
to read your emails anymore. It will automatically read them, and at that point, you're just going to have a bunch of machines talking to each other,
Yeah.
slowly degrading the conversation into nonsense, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's just bizarre. Like what's the
But
point? How
but
does that seem like a good idea?
well, in many ways, we are getting to a point of automating performativity. Um, and that's kind of in that world where you're automating performativity and you're not having a conversation about how do we work less or what can we do that's better for with our time.
Hmm.
That is just a kind of Kafkaesque hellscape, right?
Yeah.
We're stuck inside all day, staring at a computer, and we're contributing nothing to society, but we have to be at that computer.
Yeah. Yeah. I, d- I mean, you said I've got a quote here actually from your paper where it says, from an efficiency perspective, the technical question, can a particular technology perform a task, is less important than the organizational question, should the task be performed? And the managerial question, who should perform the task? Right. So it's like, I mean, it goes back to your whole, what, techno apathy thing, right? Where this conversation is ostensibly about AI, but maybe it isn't, right? Maybe it's actually about like management and organization and how all these decisions are made, because they're what's leading to the bad application of what is a fundamentally interesting and probably useful technology.
Yeah, I think so. I haven't quite phrased it in a nice quotable segment, but if AI really is a radically transformative technology, we should expect to see radical transformation of organizations. And
Mm,
instead, what we are seeing is AI being plugged into the easiest parts of organizations as they currently exist, and in
Mm.
many ways, kind of a resistance to any fundamental change in organization. But that to me is just indicative of it's, of course, the technology is going to be used wrong because we're not actually questioning how we are organizing ourselves to begin with. You know, the reason we remember electrification and we remember Ford and we remember the engine is those technologies and those managerial practices around those technologies forced a radical reorganization of how the economy worked.
Mm.
Um, and we're currently not seeing that with AI.
Should we talk a bit about the potential reactions? Because we sort of talked about where AI has come from politically and economically, but like where is it going? Because you one of your papers is more about not 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 where it's come from, but where what's going to happen now, right? Because of the various political impacts it has, right? So there are a few of those. Could you sort of start to talk us through them?
Yeah, so my main argument here is the AI tools and products that we are currently experiencing and beginning to interact with were largely developed in a political economy, by which I mean some political activism and economic situations. In a political economy, that is quite different to the one we now have because AI does pull on, say, uh, copyright and worker protections, and from an environmental perspective, things like water access and energy. Um, and so my argument is AI in the future is likely to be shaped much more by a political reaction to the technology than by any substantial technological developments.
Mm.
I mean things like uh, exploited data labelers. So to create artificial intelligence as we currently have it, you need a huge amount of labor power to label data, and once it's labeled, to then look at the outputs and give it
Mm.
feedback to improve it. Huge amount of labor power. Almost all of it is outsourced to the developing world and to emerging economies. People are paid poverty wages and they're exposed to terrible, you know, sexually violent and racist material. Um,
Mm.
we shouldn't want to use technology that's built on that exploitation. But equally, the people who are being exploited will probably at some point not want to be exploited anymore. And that's
Mm.
something we should keep in mind. Another one that I think is really, really important, um, the environmental cost of these technologies. Uh, it takes a huge amount of electricity to run, not to develop, but to run AI models. And we are in a climate crisis. We have to have a deep, meaningful debate about energy infrastructure. Um, and so much of the energy around energy policy is being channeled in, well, how can we make our computers run faster? And that creates all sorts of social problems. Water is a particularly important one. You want to put your data centers need to be cooled. They get extremely hot. You need to cool them with water.
Mm.
You want to put your data centers in places that are both close to a water source, but also close enough to an urban setting whereby you don't compromise connection speeds and things like that. So you end up putting data centers next to the city's reservoir, and suddenly the city doesn't have enough water.
Mm.
That's going to prompt a political reaction, right?
Mm.
Um, and I see all of the. I don't want to like talk as if I'm some sort of sage or some sort of prophet. All these conversations are often happen separately, but they will manifest as one sort of collective force of we are angry and we're not necessarily sure why we're angry and we want something done about it, and that will shape uh, AI policy, whether it's positive or negative. I think it is likely. Uh, I don't want to get too political here. I think it is likely, given the connection between Silicon Valley and various government administrations,
Mm.
that the exploitation of the social contract will continue and that people will get angrier and angrier. But these are factors which will inevitably, one way or another, shape the future of AI development.
It's really worth pausing on this, and it applies to AI in droves. It does also apply to the whole digital economy, though, because I think we've got this idea of like the cloud and sort of a minority report style information just moving around, and it's all kind of up in the air, and it doesn't really seem to have any real world corollary, but like it does like, aside from just the energy used in, like, starting up a computer, especially a big one, all the servers stuff that's in the cloud is stored on servers. Like you said, they have to be cooled. That uses water as well as energy. Usually people are exploited pretty horribly at some point in the process. Lithium mining, mines in Indonesia, right? All of these things. And then there's also something which I don't think you mentioned, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's the ongoing sort of theft of intellectual
Yeah.
property from kind of everybody, right? So it's like,
Yes.
it's sort of like all the bad things about capitalism on steroids and completely hidden, right? It's like, the exploited workers, the environmental impact, and the general sort of exploitation of the rest of society as well, right? It's just like, that is what's currently behind a lot of these models, and I think people just don't realize that to the extent that they should.
I think in many ways, what is happening to develop AI right now and to develop this promised artificial general intelligence is lots of sacrifices put on the public, which critics of climate policy will say climate activists want to do. Right?
Yeah,
Total destruction of
yeah,
our way of life
yeah,
to try and reach some utopia which no one can quite define. It's the criticism that's leveled at climate activists, but AI advocates are doing that right now. They are betting that they will build a machine that can solve every problem they create. And I don't like taking risks, but I think even a gambler might not bet on them being able to pay it off.
I mean, let to that end, let's talk about the quality deterioration, right, or the inshitification, perhaps, as it loops back on itself and runs out of data. Because this is something else that you were analysing, and do you think this is it going to kind of come to a screeching halt? Is it going to implode, or what's going to happen there?
Yeah, it's a funny literature because and you do have to recognize that different people have different like incentives. There are a few studies which suggest that if you train an AI on AI generated data long enough, it just turns into nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
And there's technical reasons for this. An LLM is excellent at predicting the average, pretty good at predicting like a standard deviation away, and terrible at predicting 10 standard deviations away. If you just train it on average over and over and over, your bell curve just narrows to a point, right? And then it can't really
Yes.
extrapolate from it, right? So that's one concern. The reason it's interesting, but maybe not something we should see as the main problem, just as a component, is it usually takes a dozen or so iterations of training before it really collapses badly. I think it collapses faster in image generation, but text generation, it can be trained on AI generated text a bit longer. Um, my I think when you take that model collapse and put it into, well, where is the data actually coming from? So much of the data these models are trained on is the internet. It's just people talking to each other. And as AI becomes more integrated online, it will probably have a degrading quality in terms of
Mm,
the quality of conversations within forums, and it will drive people like this is known as the dark forest theory of the internet, that public forums people will start disappearing and we will all end up in our private little Discord chats because that's the only way we can make sure we're talking to one another.
oh my god.
Um, and so I think it's a combination of model collapse, but also people will withdraw from the public
Mm.
domain. Um, and over time, you will get AI generated data that tends towards the average, but the human generated data will also be of a lower quality than it is now.
The human data generated data will be of a lower quality, because, sorry, I feel like I didn't quite
Yeah,
understand that
well,
point.
let's say you upload a video
Yeah.
and 99% of your comments are going to be bots.
Right.
Over time, are you going to put more or less effort into your videos?
Right. Okay.
Do you get what I mean,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. 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 It's not possible for me to put less effort into my videos. No,
I mean,
they're already bad enough.
maybe if the bots are giving you millions and millions of views, you'll really start pumping the videos
God,
out.
it is just like it's just a really it's kind of a really depressing lesson in Goodhart's law as well, isn't it? Because it's like when something becomes a measure, it ceases to be a good measure, and it's just like that whatever metrics we're using just become as they are exploited by AI, right? They just become less and less useful.
And yeah, and I should say one of the, or I find one of the more interesting things that's happening on the internet right now are these conversations about, I think Robin Burgeon calls it rewilding the internet. This idea
Yes.
of we need to stop relying on platforms so much, kind of be willing to become students again, learn how to make your own websites, uh, create your own sort of chat rooms and messaging forums, basically reintroduce a degree of wildness that existed before, say, social media took over. Um, and I won't go into this too much, but I think that is an interesting way of taking the internet forward. If we kind of, rather than being netizens, we realized there was a citizenship component to being on the internet.
Yeah.
We might end up getting a more interesting internet. Um, and AI, yeah, it could all be scrapes and it could be used to train models. But if people cared about what was actually put online, right,
Mm.
if we stopped caring about likes and clicks and actually the quality of the conversation, then AI would quickly become very uncool to use. It would quickly lose its uses. And maybe I'm being too optimistic here. That is potentially a force which pushes back on the the what's the word I'm looking for? The slow AI transformation of the internet into a sterile place.
Well, it's Polanyi's double movement, right, in the
Yeah.
context of the internet. I think where people rebel against the incursion of like market forces and private forces. I think that's yeah. I mean, a good example is always Wikipedia. That's always my favorite example. And it's you and I are the similar age, so um, Wikipedia did used to be the butt of a lot of jokes. And now it's just like the only remaining good website.
There, there was a time when you really shouldn't cite Wikipedia, but now Wikipedia is really quite a good
Yeah,
source.
yeah. Just and that is just like you said like digital citizens, right? Wikipedia has digital citizens. It has very dedicated people and who like update it and check it, and it's very controlled, right? And it's like it's a common pool resource that people tend to without really worrying about money or even clout, because you don't really know you can check who's edited a Wikipedia page, but the average user isn't like, oh, they can't name the top Wikipedia page editor in the same way they can name like Mr. Beast, for instance, right? It's
Yeah.
nowhere near it doesn't like give you anywhere near as much clout. So it's that kind of internet, which is kind of boring, isn't it, in a way? Because Wikipedia is very boring. It doesn't look particularly good, but it's really, really functional, and it's a positive example.
But it's also interesting that that's the kind of internet which, when I talk to people who are sadly a lot younger than me now, that's the kind of internet which they feel the false nostalgia for. They kind of want to have experienced
Yeah,
that internet where it's just a bunch of losers on chat forums, but losers who know absolutely everything about that one specific topic
yeah.
you need, you know?
Well, it's the early internet, isn't it? As well, that's
Yeah.
what it was like when it was open source, right? And it was before sort of Bill Gates and intellectual property and everything. I mean, now intellectual property is devouring itself with AI, right? But it's like it's just that type of thing. Yeah, it's good that people want it back. I mean, we mentioned Blue Sky earlier. I think although Blue Sky does have like some retweets and stuff, it's close. It's more in that direction. I think the
Yeah.
mod team seem to be the devs there and the mod team seem to be more having that kind of thing in mind than something like
Yeah.
what Twitter's become.
Yeah. Yeah. As a purist, I perhaps would still criticize Blue Sky for having things like likes and retweets because I
Yeah,
think those are artificial metrics which affect how we
yeah,
like live on the internet. But I agree with you. If you're going to have a social media,
mm.
it feels like the more febrile early social media where
Yeah.
things were actually interesting.
And likes and retweets do less there than they do on
Yeah,
like Twitter, right? It's like you don't your feed is the people you follow. You can select, you can look for the most liked tweets and stuff, and maybe you would say as a purist that that shouldn't be there at all. But like your default feed is just the people you follow, right? Which is like it just even that. It's amazing how much that
it,
changes
it,
things.
it, it is quite radical nowadays to build a website where you kind of promote yourself by rejecting there being an algorithm. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah. Exactly, exactly. And it's yeah. So I mean, it is optimistic, right? I mean, you keep apologizing for being optimistic, but it's like people don't. I mean, one of the corollaries of everything that we've been saying and that you've been saying, right, is that people don't. Technology doesn't come from nowhere, but then people don't just take it lying down. People don't accept it and its consequences lying down, and that has been true for a lot of very disruptive technologies in the past as well, right? And I think eventually the public has to sort of take control of them one way or the other.
yeah. I mean, and I am always a cynic, but I have heard some people suggest that AI is perhaps the last chance saloon for Silicon Valley now. We've had so many world-changing technologies which have deteriorated into collapsed companies and financial scams.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
like people are going to pick up on it, and none of these technologies have ultimately, you made the average wage earner earn more money or
yeah.
increase the amount of food you can eat or reduce house prices. Like none of these technologies have changed material conditions,
Mm.
um, or in a positive way, I should say. And people will pick up on that sooner or later. And like I say, there are some commentators who think it is now sooner rather than later.
I mean, do you think that AI is a bubble? Would you characterize it as a bubble?
Um, I, I think so. It's important to distinguish between something being a bubble and something being useless. I think there are
Yeah.
definitely applications to AI technology, but speaking as an economist, is supply of the AI technologies massively outstripping demand? Probably. Right?
Mm.
If at the end of the day AI is applied mostly in medical decision making, maybe pharmaceutical discovery, maybe some sort of high tech engineering areas, then we already have all the super high end graphic cards that we need for that. So, so
Mm.
where would be like Nvidia's value really be? You know, um,
Yeah, I was reading an article about Joey Politano about how the AI boom, let's call it to be neutral, is it's leading to a lot of investment in infrastructure and buildings, internet infrastructure, and even renewable energy, right? Because of all the energy it uses, which is, yeah, like bubbles. Firstly, yeah, the technology itself doesn't have to be useless for it to be a bubble. Railways are a bubble. But also, a bubble can have some positive consequences outside just through the boom it creates. But I mean, I don't know. I've thought that Silicon Valley, broadly defined, was a bubble since for a very long time, and I just sort of I've been waiting to gleefully clasp my hands when it does burst.
what's interesting about Silicon Valley is it only really takes off after the 2008 crisis.
Mm,
It did kind of exist beforehand, but it was small enough before the crisis that it didn't, it wasn't too exposed to the crisis, so it could pick itself up and keep going. So Silicon Valley in its current form hasn't gone through a substantial financial crisis
mm,
ever. And the COVID pandemic, which is the closest thing to a crisis, was perhaps the perfect crisis for Silicon Valley because it forces all to use technology more.
yeah.
It's never really been stress tested against the fundamentals of the economy.
Mm, yeah. God, I don't. Yeah, I'm kind of. I don't like to doom monger and like uh, take joy in bad things happening that affect loads of people. But I do just feel like that seeing that bubble burst would be a bit of a relief, to be honest, because of all of the things that we've been discussing and more, right? We haven't even talked about privacy concerns and all of those types of things, and inequality more generally, right? And Elon Musk, right? So like all of those things, it's just like, yeah, I wonder if that would help with the double movement we were discussing, right? Because it's like then people can take control of the internet.
Well, hopefully. I mean, information, unlike land, doesn't degrade. And doesn't
Right.
it isn't exhausted, and I see that as a hopeful. If we're talking about Poloni's perspective, it is possible, I think, for us to push back against the privatization of the internet,
Mm,
because the internet is a technology, but it's also just where people are, and we can choose to be in a different place.
mm, yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I was interested actually that you went down this route in your paper because it was uh, you were calling for more participatory organizational forms, right? And there was even a little bit about worker democracy and stuff, right? So is this like, I mean, there was this whole thing about managers and how managers at different levels, like junior managers, should be favored over senior managers for making decisions, and this kind of ties into the AI thing because I think instead of, and this is what you said right at the beginning, instead of just replacing workers with AI, which is what senior management might want,
Yeah,
or the board or whatever, right? You're actually looking at empowering workers and
yeah,
workers having more of a say in being able to do their jobs
yeah,
better.
yeah. I mean, and that to an extent is a riff on Asimoglu's recent advocacy that automation is bad, augmentation is what actually delivers
Yeah.
value. But the perspective we developed in the paper about reorganization and empowering workers and democracy is really an old riff on Herbert Simon.
Mm.
I don't know how much the audience know, but Herbert
Please
Simon's
explain. Please explain. Yeah.
yeah, Herbert Simon starts out as a political scientist who is studying how organizations work. Um, he kind of becomes an economist because he has to develop a bunch of ideas about behavior to explain organizations, which apply to economics. Um, but then in the mid 1950s, he does what appears initially to be a really radical pivot, and he goes full force into AI, and he spends most of his career working on uh, early artificial intelligence systems, and he is today known as the father of AI. And lots of people look at that trajectory and they think this is really strange, right? He won a Nobel Prize in economics, but he started out studying organizations and he ended working on AI. But it's not if you really try and figure out what he was thinking about. From Simon's perspective, AI and an organization and a human decision maker, they're all just ways of like trying to navigate and weigh up information and come to reasonable decisions. An organization, I would argue, you can think of kind of as an artificial intelligence. It's
Mm.
different people coming together, they work together, they share information to try and arrive at an organizational outcome which is best for the organization and for themselves. If you have that idea in mind, it's not that much of a leap to then think, well, okay, how could we perhaps connect computers together to achieve similar outcomes? And so we kind of approach that question of how to use AI in an organization as an information management question. And we got a bit meta about it. And we said, well, technology is often misdeployed because organizations misuse their informational resources. And if you want to use your information better, you've got to change how you organize your organization. So get workers involved, delegate authority, use democracy, because that's a great way of combining disparate information. Um, People might disagree with that perspective, but that intellectually is where it comes from. The organization itself is a kind of artificial intelligence.
It's so interesting to bring all that together, and Herbert Simon is the king, for sure. But like, it's just yeah, this simple like, how do you make a decision? How do we make decisions, right? And I guess that's the question Herbert Simon was asking, right? And that can lead you to individual cognitive stuff, right? How does one make decisions? Organizational stuff. How do we use organizations to make decisions? And then also AI, because it's yet another tool for making decisions, right? So it's really deep. I mean, I guess it's quite funny because when I hear about this, I do this. I think this has always been what I've been motivated by and how I've seen things, even though I didn't realize it. And I kind of needed Herbert Simon to show me that. But it's like that. It seems to me to be the fundamental question of like economics. And I think economists define decision making, but they define it in a very narrow way. They're sort of the whole people respond to incentives for economics type crap. And like, it's much more fundamental. Like Herbert Simon goes much deeper, doesn't he? He goes much deeper and asks these really fundamental questions, which is why we love him.
Yeah, I mean, there is a book that in my head I'll one day write where the opening line is the fundamental question of economics was solved by Herbert Simon. The rest is just politics, right? Because he basically makes the argument that there are different ways of organizing systems, and depending on what you want the system to do, you need to change how you organize it. And you can go totally decentralized or fully centralized, and there is a blurry space in the middle. And actually, most things happen in the middle, and that's what we need to study. And I worry I might be drifting on it.
No.
But like that is the Simon insight. And if I am to kind of bring it back to AI, I think today the obsession over there being an objective decision, that there is a right and a wrong answer, is reflected in the way that AI is built as a predictive tool.
Yeah, because it takes inputs. It's amoral, right? It's amoral. So it takes an input and gives you an output. But really, we need to be asking. We need to be asking, what are we asking it, and why? Right. That's the thing. The thing is not so much the technology.
It's why. Well, Herbert Simon back in 1987 wrote a paper about human AI collaboration, and his argument in that paper is we need to build artificial intelligences to allow people to exercise their good judgment as best as possible. He saw it all about empowering people because people themselves are incredible decision makers. They have a lot of knowledge, they have a lot of skills, and technology should assist in elevating those skills rather than replacing them. Modern AI, I think, sees those skills and thinks, okay, how can we build it into a machine? And then the machine can get rid of the person.
I mean, let me push this argument as far as it will go, right? Because I've had the thought, and I'm not alone in this, and I'm far from the first person, and Herbert Simon may have said it as well. But when we think about AI and the pitfalls of AI, aside from the horrible stuff, when we think about the problems with its output, right, we think about a sort of lowest common denominator type slop. You said it gives you an average, right? You think about like some of the really just weird pictures that it can produce and that kind of thing, how generic the report summary from Apple can be. Now, it does strike me that we kind of already do this without AI as well. So have you ever seen Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania?
No, I have taste, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Well, I have enough taste to turn it off after 20 minutes, but like, but it's so bad, but it's not just bad. It feels like an AI generated film, but it's a kind of real film, right? And everything from just the effects to like the storyline and the dialogue feels like it's generated by AI. And I think you could make similar arguments for other films, for some music, for some TV series, for some websites, and so on. And it does feel like our economic system is kind of doing this, regurgitate the lowest common denominator back at us. It's doing that already. And AI is, it's going to help it. It's going to magnify the process and accelerate it and stuff. But is it sort of, is AI just the latest iteration of this? Is the problem located really elsewhere?
Well,
It's a big
I mean,
question. It's a
you know
ridiculously
my
big question.
politics. I guess
Yeah.
I would say yes. But like, technology doesn't come from nowhere. It is driven by
Yeah.
political economic forces.
Yeah.
Um, and I think we can view AI as an automating force, and it is trying to automate knowledge work and to an extent creative production. Um, and when you don't have humans throwing something new into the mix or challenging things, you will just get this reversion to the average. Um, and it will happen in various different domains. Organizations will increasingly be set up around, well, have you produced your AI generated report today?
Mm.
In the same way that movie studios will increasingly use algorithms and whatever data they've got to produce films that will maximize box office revenue whilst minimizing the cost of producing them.
Yeah.
Um, and if I am to put an economic spin on this, you could go back to like Ricardo or whatever, and he would talk about how on paper this should be great because the cost of goods is being driven down to its bare minimum. But we're not actually talking about things like bread. We're
Yeah.
talking about we're talking about information products which we
Mm.
consume in part to fill up our soul, give us a meaning. And what happens when all of the sort of cultural artifacts you've grown up with are totally disposable and forgettable and bad? Like, who do you become as a person?
Mm.
That's a very philosophical question, but it is important to distinguish between, are we getting the price of bread down as low as possible, or are we getting the price of the things humans actually want to be doing down as low as possible?
Yeah, I mean, I can make my peace if my Hovis loaf is kind of at the average loaf of bread, right? And that's the price of mass production and feeding everybody. I can make my peace, but yeah, it doesn't for art and things. It doesn't work. And I mean, it's interesting because I thought about this in the context of planned obsolescence, right? And how we, with stuff like our phones, you're not attached to your phone like as an object. Like you don't like people smash their phones pretty regularly. Like I don't give a shit about this thing. There's stuff on it that's important, but that's transferable as well, right? It's not an object that I care about. And like you said, like we don't have these cultural attachments to things anymore. And I feel like it's actually quite a broad thing that includes AI, but also goes outside of it as well, right? Whereas if you compare like a phone to something like, I don't know, a book that you bought at a fair or something, then you'll have a much bigger attachment to it. But it's just this general thing. I don't know, maybe they're different points, but it's just this general thing of everything becoming
No,
average and
no, no, no.
disposable.
I should remember who it is, but I forget one of the early Frankfurt School guys, and obviously the Frankfurt School did a load of stuff about capitalism and culture. Um, it, to put it in terms of phones, you actually do care a huge amount about your phone right
Mm.
now, the one you're using,
Yeah,
because it has such functionality in your life. But the moment you get a new phone,
yeah,
you're never going to look at your old one again.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
like
yeah.
it's the actual stuff that is being produced is valueless to people. It only gains value within the context that it has to be used for a brief period of time.
And I think one issue with AI is that almost by construction and inevitably, nothing it produces has any intrinsic value.
No, like I'm not opposed to the idea that a really creative person can and will do something brilliant and genius with generative AI.
Mm,
I think it will happen.
mm,
But it will be entirely because that person was brilliant and creative, and
mm.
whatever they turned themselves to would be brilliant and creative. The AI is just kind of a means to an end for them. And generative AI itself, if I type into ChatGPT now, write something brilliant and creative, it's not going to, and it's never going to.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, have an idea. I don't think you can't have ideas, right? That's the thing. Um, you just worry about the death of ideas.
I should say again, we would never actually even ask ourselves, can it have an idea, if we talked about it as a diffusion engine rather than as
Yeah,
artificial
yeah, yeah,
intelligence.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Exactly. If we completely reframe it, but Yeah, I think. I mean, I think that's it's a kind of optimistic-ish place to end, or is it optimistic or pessimistic? It's both. I think we're always both. I feel like I'm. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
conditional optimism, isn't it? It's there's great potential, but we're not currently on that road. But I think it's been so interesting to speak to you, and there's lots more to your research as well. But I was thinking maybe we could go into the dark patterns and website design another time, which I know you said that sounds boring, but I think my viewers would like that because it's very internety, and on the internet we love to complain about the internet. But anyway, yeah, for now, thanks so much for joining me, Stuart. It's been such an interesting and like free ranging chat.
No, thank you so much. I will go back through the chat later to see all the
See what people are saying.
hopefully
Yeah.
nice things, but I'm sure horrible
Yeah,
things.
they're well, yeah. No, that is nothing horrible, nothing horrible. But
Yeah.
sometimes on topic, sometimes off topic is the way I'd characterize it. But
Well,
that's
well,
usual.
as a chatter, yeah, I can agree.
But
Sometimes we do go off
yeah,
topic.
yeah, it's fine. It's a forum, right? But one other thing I would say is I would definitely read that book that starts with Herbert Simon solve the economic problem. Everything else is politics. I think that'd be really cool.
Well, at least I'll have one sale.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you so
See you
much.
later, Stuart. Okay, good. Everybody. Thanks for joining, everybody. And is the description the Kyla Scanlon one? Because now everything I do, it's just the Kyla Scanlon description as the default. But I thought I changed it, and apparently I didn't. So I will change it, and it will be right on the release and stuff. Anyway, see you tomorrow if you're coming to watch the tiny little gaming stream. If not yet, what I